Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you all with us today on Thursday, September 28th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Scott Finn, who is the president and CEO of Vermont Public. Scott is joining us remotely from up north there in Winooski, I guess?
Colchester.
Colchester. Well, that was close. Anyway, Scott, as many of you know, came to Vermont Public Radio, as it was then, back in 2018, and has overseen the merger of Vermont Public Radio and Vermont Public Television. Before he came to Vermont Public Radio, he worked as a sixth grade teacher, a community organizer, and a journalist before being chosen in 2013 to lead West Virginia Public Broadcasting. He became the president and CEO of Vermont Public Radio in 2018, and as I said, he helped facilitate that merger between VPR and Vermont Public Broadcasting back in 2020, 2021. And Scott, thank you very much for making the time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to be with us today and share some of your thinking and perspectives on what you all do at Vermont Public and where the future of journalism in Vermont is going. I guess just to get us started here, can you tell us a little bit about Vermont Public and what do you see as the mission of the station?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, for having me on. Vermont Public serves about 1 million people every single month, both in Vermont, surrounding areas, and then what we call Vermonters of the mind, who live all over the world, because with the internet, anyone can reach you. And we have about 100 employees and 40,000 members. And anyone who gives us money in the course of about a year is a member. And that's just a tremendous asset. Our mission is to serve a broad and diverse audience through stories and information, bring people together. And so I think both of those things are really important. You know, public media is for everyone, and we work really hard to make sure that we're including all the different groups, geographic areas, economic groups, races, backgrounds in our coverage on our team. And then stories that bring people together is important too. You know, a lot of our media today is designed to divide us into groups and to basically, generate outrage. And we really have a different attitude here. It's all about helping people get information to engage in society in a productive way.
And so what prompted the merger then 2 or 3 years ago between VPR and the public broadcasting? Was that an idea that had kind of been in the works for a while, or was that something that you kind of pushed forward?
It's been talked about off and on, I think, since the beginning of both organizations. First Vermont ETV, later Vermont Public Television, and Vermont PBS has always done a wonderful job with public affairs programming. We're strong in video production, kids programming, and educational services. And then things like Vermont This Week, the news show. VPR is extremely strong in daily news and in-depth news, music, especially classical music, and other types of cultural programming. And so in bringing these two things together, you have a real synergy, because you have, for example, on the Vermont PBS side, the ability to use video to reach younger and more diverse audiences, because video is the medium that younger people are using more than anything else. And on the VPR side, we brought a lot of strength in things like news. We have a large audience for that. And so I think you saw those things come together, Andrew, during our coverage of the floods in July. There was a lot of coordination between our video and our news teams, and you were seeing information, stories on all different types of platforms, online as well as radio and TV. And that's the strength of the merger, right? We can serve people on more different platforms in a better way. So that's the main reason that we did it.
So what type of news stories do you look for? Or, I mean, you have such an amazing variety of programming on the radio, on television, on your website. I guess I just wondered, are there certain types of stories you're kind of looking for on a daily basis from your staff, or how does it work?
Yeah, So I'm really fortunate as the CEO here to have a very talented news team with their own news leadership. And so, I'm not involved in the day to day anymore, sadly, because I love that. But I do talk with our news leadership about how they make these decisions and what our philosophy is. And we kind of look at sort of the bigger picture. So there are great media organizations that do, like, this is exactly what happened today, the car wreck and the sort of the crime stories. We're a statewide organization. We don't have the ability to cover all of that anyway. And so what we try to focus on really is, what does it mean? What's the bigger trend? How's this affecting people's lives? And another thing that we do, I think that's really cool, Andrew, is that we have what we call engagement journalism. And all that means is that we work with our audience to tell stories together. And so, for example, you have a project like Brave Little State, where we ask the audience to generate questions. Those questions are voted up and down. And then the winning question, we report out, a reporter often working with the question asker, the audience member, to find the answer to that question. And it's funny, I'm a former journalist, and I would have been reluctant to cede that sort of decision making to my audience. I'd be worried that, I'd be doing a lot of stories about, cats and things like that. But in our experience, actually, our audience is so engaged. Their questions are so important. And the stories that we do with our audience are the ones that tend to get the most engagement as well. Like, we have more people reading those stories, sharing those stories. So that's our philosophy. It's trying to get to the bigger story and also working with our audience to tell stories together.
One of the things I've noticed in your coverage is that you seem to be really trying to reach out to cover all parts of the state, particularly rural areas that sometimes tend to have sort of less of a news presence, let's say, than Chittenden County might. Is that something that was it a deliberate part of a strategy you all are working on, or did it just kind of amorphously happen that way?
Yeah, it's a responsibility, right? Because we are a statewide organization, and it's often said to us that Vermont Public helps to actually bring the state together. It's a long way from Essex County to Bennington, right? And to how do we bring together people that will never meet each other face to face? And the media is one important way that happens. It is a challenging thing when I'm based in the Burlington area, right? It's really easy to cover what you know and what you see. So we make a real effort to try to fight against that tendency in a lot of different ways. One way is that not all our reporters live here. We have reporters in central Vermont. We have reporters in the Upper Valley. We have Howard Wise Tisman living in Brattleboro, covering southern Vermont. And so we deliberately, space out our reporters in different places to be able to, because we know that when you live in a community, you have a different perspective about what's a story than when you kind of parachute into a community from someplace else. And so we have a tagline, Andrew, it's stories from every corner. And for us, that means every corner of Vermont, and also, every street corner, every place where two roads come together, and it's called a corner. We're trying our best to have that sort of geographic diversity. We could do more, but it's really a value.
I was wondering, what do you see as the major challenges facing not only organizations such as yours, but journalism in general, or journalism in Vermont, let's say, to kind of narrow that down a little bit. There's been so much written about newspapers and other media organizations struggling to kind of get by financially, and newspapers closing, particularly small local papers, just having a hard time retaining staff and getting the kind of advertising revenue that they traditionally had back in the past. Are those what you see as the kind of major challenges facing news gathering and journalism in general, or are there more other things that you find yourself thinking about?
Absolutely. And I could talk about this for a long time. My personal background, as you said, I was a newspaper journalist. I worked for a really great crusading family newspaper called the Charleston Gazette in Charleston, West Virginia. Two things happened to the Charleston Gazette recently. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and it went bankrupt. So the problem there is that great journalism by itself is not enough. We need to be able to figure out how to sustain it. And the business model of purchasing a piece of, a bunch of paper and having subscriptions or one-time purchases of that. And that one piece of paper had the want ads and the other ads in there, and that sustained all the news gathering and all the things that maybe were not so lucrative. That model has fallen apart. It's called disaggregation. It's a fancy word for, now you go to Indeed.com for your jobs instead of your local newspaper, right? And the newspaper has lost that income. In public media, public radio and TV, we're a little bit more fortunate. We have a different model that relies largely on small dollar membership. Membership is about 60% of our income. So that is a model that's more resilient to some of those pressures. But we are feeling them. So one problem is the decline in local media in general. The number of journalists in Vermont, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has declined by about 50% in the last 20 years. And that's in Vermont. And most of that's happening in local newspapers. So it's a real problem. In places that have lost their local newspaper, you're more likely to have a higher rate of corruption and less political participation and more partisan division. And that's the result of several studies that have gone on nationally. So local media is really important, and people should support, and not take for granted institutions like yours, their local newspaper, and then, things like Vermont Public, because we're really performing this invaluable service to your community.
One of the things I've thought a lot about and I've read a lot about is that the decline of local journalism, small newspapers, or whatever other news gathering organizations people get their information from, has contributed a lot to the political polarization that we're seeing across the country at the moment. Do you think that's a fair connection, or not?
Absolutely, and I also think there's a lot of academic research that supports that as well. Local news, people have, I think, a healthy distrust of the media in general, and I think it's fair. And local news is more trusted than social media, national news sources. It kind of makes sense, Andrew. I'm sure people come up to you in the farmer's market and they have something to say about your election. I know it happens to me all the time too. I get direct feedback from the local audience, and that's helpful. It keeps us honest. And it also helps, build trust. But when there are fewer local media outlets and fewer local reporters, then, people tend to fill that vacuum with national news or, with stuff from social media that may not be true. And so I think absolutely, preserving your local news media, and Vermont still has a fairly healthy local news ecosystem. I think we have to work really hard to keep it, because I think that even in Vermont, some of our traditions are in danger unless we protect local media.
Do you see a pathway out of that? I find myself thinking, well, classified advertising that used to support a lot of papers, that's probably not coming back to the degree that it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, or whenever the golden days were. Social media seems to be able to suck up a lot of reporting and put it out, and people seem to be going to social media platforms for some information which may or may not be as vetted as what a traditional paper or news gathering organization might have felt obligated to make sure. I just wonder, how do we kind of return, if it's possible, given how much change has happened technologically and what have you, to get back to a point where we do have healthy local grassroots news organizations that people can trust?
I think it starts with people paying for the news that they are using. And that is true online as well as with a physical print product. Or if they're watching the program, if there are ways to contribute, if you go to vermontpublic.org, you can contribute to our network as well. People have to learn that they can't take this for granted, that someone else can't do it for them, that they think this is important. They need to support it with their dollars when they can. And for those who can't do it, we need to support it so that it's there for them as well. That's really important. It makes me feel better. There's some research, Andrew, that says that young people, I'm talking like folks in their 20s and 30s, they really do want reliable information from reliable sources. They seek it out. And they're getting more savvy, like the younger folks are actually more savvy online about figuring out what's misinformation and what's true, and more discerning. And they do seek out traditional media sources they trust. So there's a demand for what we're doing. The issue is, how do we support it? It's like that story I told about my former newspaper. You know, it's not enough just to win the Pulitzer Prize. We have to figure out financially how to make it happen. And the places that are making it work are relying on small dollar donations and subscriptions. That's the most stable form of income. And so if more people subscribe to the local paper, donate to local media, that's what will preserve it.
Well, you sort of anticipated my next question, which was, what advice would you give to, let's say, a college student or someone who's just starting out in journalism, a young reporter who wants to be a journalist? You know, the field has changed so much over the past 10 or 20 years. What advice would you give them as they sort of plan their career going forward?
You know, it's funny. I've taught journalism at the college level, and we have lots and lots of interns that come through Vermont Public as well from different colleges. And it's kind of twofold. I mean, on one hand, you have to be realistic about the marketplace, and there aren't as many journalism jobs as there used to be. That's just true. At the same time, if you have a real passion for it, there's still a place for you. And we need young, passionate reporters because they're the ones that help us reach these new audiences. The other thing that I tell them is, like, you know, some of you may start in journalism and then end up doing something else. It is a great place, a good training ground to sharpen your skills in communication, in analyzing information and research. And I see former journalists all over the place in terms of law and politics and academia, and doing great things in the world. So I think journalism is a great training ground for young people, whether they just do it in college or whether they do it as a career to start off. You know, it may be a lifetime for them, like it has been for me, or it may be something that leads them to some other career, but it's a great place to start.
One of the things I always found really interesting about being in the field is that it's an opportunity to satisfy curiosity about almost everything. I mean, whether or not it's like a business or education or politics or the arts. I mean, you know, you name it, the science or whatever. You know, it's almost an opportunity to kind of learn more about something that you didn't know about before, and you have a license to dive in and you know, satisfy your own curiosity about it. And I really can't think of another field where you have that opportunity to kind of, you know, just sort of find out about something you suddenly find interesting.
Yeah, I was a journalist for more than 10 years. It's the most fun job in the world for that very reason. And what you find out is that everybody has a story, and the stories are fascinating. If you can get someone to open up and you can dig deep enough, you can find the thing about them that is unique to themselves and worth telling to the world. And so, you know, one of the challenges that I had when I was a journalism student is we were told to go out and meet someone, and for a Labor Day special, meet someone that you don't know. I mean, just walk out, go down the street, find someone who works, and then interview them, and then do a story about them. And you know, it's completely random. And every time I did that, it was a good story. People are fascinated. And so, yeah, there's no, I think for me, there's no other job in the world that is as fun and as satisfying as being a journalist.
Let me just pivot slightly here, and I'm fascinated by the fact that you came to Vermont from West Virginia. I can't think of two states that are sort of more different culturally. But tell me about what it was like running West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I mean, your audience there, I'm going to guess, was a little bit different from your average audience here in Vermont. I mean, what were some of the kind of the priorities you felt were important to kind of report on back in Charleston or wherever else in West Virginia you were covering?
Well, first of all, I got to start by saying that I love West Virginia. I'm not a native West Virginian. I grew up in Iowa and I found my way to West Virginia, but I loved the state, and I married a West Virginia girl, and it's still very important in my heart. And it's an amazing place for a storyteller because at first, West Virginia is a state that's experienced a lot of oppression, frankly, and people who have really hard economic times. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And so at first, as a journalist, you go up to West Virginia and they're kind of resistant and skeptical. But if you can stick with it and push through that and get to the other side of it, they're the most wonderful storytellers. They'll tell you everything and anything about their lives, and they speak in such beautiful, colorful language. It was fascinating and endlessly rewarding to be a journalist in West Virginia because the people are wonderful, and also they have some real problems, systematic issues with corruption, with a political system that's dominated by coal and other natural resources. And so, telling those stories, it's very easy, and there's a lot of color to them. It was a great place to be a journalist. As we used to say, it's a target-rich environment for journalism. On the flip side, there's just fewer resources. There are a lot fewer reporters. In West Virginia Public Broadcasting, it served an audience of about 1.8 million people, but the newsroom was maybe a third of the size of the newsroom at Vermont Public. And so it felt more like triage, trying to figure out what stories to tell, because you never could really do enough. But it's a lovely place to be a journalist. It is a little different from Vermont politically. It was the second most Trump supporting state. I think Vermont was the least Trump supporting state. But there are lots of Republicans and Trump supporters in Vermont, and there's lots of liberal Democrats in West Virginia as well. They're just in different proportions. And I think what I've learned is that people are much more complicated and diverse than stereotypes about each place would lead you to believe.
I have a friend down here who's from West Virginia, and we've had several interesting conversations about the different states and the different cultures. And one of the things he explained to me once was there's a sort of a sense of, I don't know if grievance is the right word, but a complicated relationship with coal companies seem to be the easy one, but all extractive industries came to the state, took a lot of the wealth and resources out of the state, and didn't seem to leave a lot behind to kind of sustain things. Was that your takeaway on the state, or is that too simplistic a read?
I think it's fair. I think, you contrast that with Vermont, and Vermont has a very different development history, mostly agricultural, very little mining. There was some timbering, but you don't have the same level of natural resource extraction. And there's lots of research that shows that this thing called the resource curse, I don't know if you've heard of that, where there are places, states, and countries that have these natural resources. You would assume that they'd be rich, but instead they're poor. And it's often a dynamic where people from outside that region come in, exploit the resources, and end up leaving pollution and other problems behind. Where ironically, some of the richest places in the world are like Switzerland, which has almost no natural resources, but its beauty and the ingenuity of its people. It's very interesting when you think about it that way. And it helps you understand if people have a grievance in West Virginia, they have a reason for that and a history behind it.
And it's interesting. Well, in the few minutes we have left, I just wondered, are there any future plans that you have in mind for Vermont Public that you can share with us at this point? Any new directions that may be seeing the station going in, or expansion of current things you're doing?
Well, you were talking about student journalists, and so I'm happy to report that University of Vermont and Vermont Public are entering into a partnership where we are splitting the cost of a full-time faculty member at the University of Vermont. that's going to help students do journalism that ends up on Vermont Public's platforms. And again, this is not necessarily, not every person in that class will become a full-time journalist. Matter of fact, most will not. But the experience of doing that journalism will be great for the students. And it's amazing what these students are producing. We have a lot of their work on our website right now. You bring it on the radio. You cannot tell that it was student work. It's professional work. And so students are also helping to fill that gap in local news by, especially at the University of Vermont, where they have the Center for Community News. A lot of students are doing community news and are helping to fill that gap that we talked about.
That's great. Well, Mr. Finn, thank you again very much for making the time for this conversation. Really appreciate it. I know you have a very busy schedule, and I appreciate you taking the time out of that to be with us today and share some of your thinking and observations about news media and what's going on at Vermont Public. I have to say, I check out your website every day and listen to you all on the radio whenever I'm driving around, and it's always very informative and interesting content to take in. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, and thanks to all of you who've been with us watching. I hope you found the program interesting. We'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, take care. Thanks again.